January 9th, 1976. The offices of United Artists, 5th Avenue, New York City. 2:15 in the afternoon. The city outside the 14th floor windows was doing what New York City did in January of 1976, which was existing in a state of controlled emergency that the people living inside it had learned to treat as normal. The garbage strike had left bags piled on corners. The subway ran when it decided to run. The mayor had gone to Washington to ask the federal government for money, and the federal government had said no in a headline that the Daily News compressed into 6 words that became the most famous newspaper headline in the city's history. New York was broke and cold and magnificent and completely indifferent to the specific situation of a 29-year-old man sitting in a waiting room on the 14th floor of a building on 5th Avenue with a manila folder on his lap and $11 in his checking account, and a wife at home who was pregnant, and a specific arithmetic of desperation that he had been living inside for long enough that he had stopped experiencing it as crisis and started experiencing it as weather. Whether you could not change. Whether you learned to move through. His name was Sylvester Stallone, and 3 weeks before this afternoon, he had stood outside a 7-Eleven on Santa Monica Boulevard in Los Angeles and sold his dog to a stranger for $25. The dog's name was Buckus, an English bulldog he had raised from a puppy, and the selling of the dog was not a dramatic gesture, and was not a metaphor, and was not a moment he had processed through any emotional framework more complicated than the one the situation required. He could not afford to feed the dog. The dog needed to be fed. He found a stranger who would pay $25 and he completed the transaction, and he stood on that sidewalk and watched a man he did not know walk away with the animal that had been his daily companion for years, the one living thing in his life that did not require him to justify himself or explain his choices or perform a version of confidence he did not always feel. And he told himself one specific thing as the man turned the corner and disappeared. He told himself he would buy the dog back.
Not someday.
When this was over. That was the promise.
Not fame.
Not money. Not the validation of everyone who had told him no across 6 years of auditioning and writing and surviving in a city that had no structural interest in his success. He was going to buy the dog back. That was what the end of this looked like. The screenplay in the manila folder on his lap was called Rocky. He had written it in 3.5 days in July of 1975 after watching a fight between Muhammad Ali and a journeyman heavyweight from Bayonne, New Jersey named Chuck Wepner at Richfield Coliseum in Ohio. Nobody gave Wepner a round against Ali. He was a liquor salesman who boxed on weekends, a man whose presence in the same ring as the greatest heavyweight of the century was understood by every boxing analyst as a foregone conclusion dressed up as a sporting event. Wepner knocked Ali down in the 9th round. He went 15 rounds. He lost on a technical knockout with 19 seconds remaining on the clock, which meant he had gone the distance in every sense that mattered except the one that showed up in the record books. Stallone watched this and felt something he could not immediately name but recognized as the most important thing he had seen in a sporting event in his life. He went home and wrote for 3.5 days, and when he finished he had 87 pages that he read back and understood were true in the specific way that things are true when a person writes not what they think will succeed, but what they needed to exist in the world, because the world had not produced it yet. He had taken the screenplay to every producer and studio contact he could reach through the network of marginal connections available to a 29-year-old actor with a speech impediment and a softcore film on his resume, and a face that casting directors had described in actual feedback as simultaneously threatening and difficult to cast. The meetings followed a pattern so consistent it had become its own education. Interest in the material. Confusion about why he was in the room. Offers to purchase the screenplay without him attached as the lead. He had said no each time with the same quiet consistency that had nothing to do with confidence and everything to do with the specific promise he had made to himself on a sidewalk in Santa Monica about what the end of this was going to look like. United Artists had come to him through a producer connection in late November 1975, which was 2 months after the dog and 4 months after the 3.5 days of writing, and the first meeting had generated an offer of $75,000 for the screenplay, without him attached as the lead, which he declined. And the second meeting had generated an offer of $150,000 for the screenplay, without him attached as the lead, which he declined, and the pattern of increasing numbers told him something important that he filed carefully alongside everything else he had learned in 6 years of navigating an industry that communicated its values most honestly not in what it said, but in what it was willing to spend. They wanted the screenplay badly enough to keep raising the number, which meant the screenplay had value. They were not going to advertise to him directly, which meant the position he was holding, the position that everyone in his life except Barbara had told him was irrational and self-destructive, and the kind of romantic stubbornness that was indistinguishable in practice from simply being wrong, was the only leverage he actually had. He understood leverage the way people understand things they have learned not from instruction, but from the repeated experience of having none. The third meeting was today, and they had told his manager there would be a new offer on the table, and that United Artists considered this the final conversation on the subject, which was a negotiating position he recognized and did not find threatening for reasons he would not have been able to articulate in the moment, but which had something to do with the fact that people who are genuinely prepared to walk away do not announce that they are prepared to walk away. They simply walk away. He had done it twice already. He knew what it felt like from the inside, and it did not feel like an announcement. It felt like weather. The particular weather of a decision already made that you are simply waiting for the right moment to act on. The waiting room assistant called his name at 2:28 p.m., and he stood and straightened the jacket that Barbara had pressed that morning without being asked, understanding that the pressing of it was the one practical contribution available to her in a situation she could not otherwise influence. And he picked up the manila folder and walked through the door into the conference room and saw 4 men instead of 2, and understood immediately what the additional presence communicated. The first 2 meetings had each involved 2 executives. For meant they were treating this as a closing argument rather than a continuing negotiation. For meant David Picker was in the room, which Stallone registered with the specific attention of someone who has spent years learning to read rooms by the quality of the people sitting in them. Picker was the president of United Artists. Presidents of studios do not attend preliminary meetings with unknown writers. His presence meant that United Artists had decided to end this today in one direction or another, and had brought the person with the most authority to ensure the ending went the way they intended. The number was on the table before anyone said good afternoon. $250,000, stated by Picker directly, and without preamble. The way you deploy the most powerful thing you have at the beginning of a confrontation rather than building toward it, because building toward it gives the other person time to construct a defense against it, and Picker had not gotten to the presidency of United Artists by giving the other person time to construct defenses. $250,000 in January of 1976 was a sum so far outside the arithmetic of Stallone's actual life that it existed in a separate category from money. It was not a number he could make real by comparing it to anything in his experience. He sat with it for a moment the way you sit with something that is trying to rearrange your understanding of what is possible, and he felt the full weight of what it would mean. Barbara, the dog, the $11, the 6 years, all of it on one side of a scale. And he looked at David Picker and said the 4 words he had said at the beginning of the previous 2 meetings with the same quiet and total absence of performance that had characterized the saying of them every previous time. I need to play Rocky. What followed was not a negotiation. Stallone would describe it later as a presentation, which was the accurate word for what the 4 men in that room proceeded to do with the coordinated efficiency of people who have divided a task among themselves in advance and rehearsed their portions until the seams between them are invisible. The first executive addressed the commercial argument. The second addressed the practical argument. The third addressed the generous argument. They were skilled and they were thorough, and they were not wrong about any of the specific points they were making, which was the thing that made the 30 minutes that followed genuinely difficult in a way that the previous 2 meetings had not been. The commercial argument was the one that had the most arithmetic behind it and was therefore the most difficult to sit inside without feeling its weight. Unknown leads do not open films. This was not an opinion about Sylvester Stallone specifically. It was a structural fact about how audiences made decisions about which films to spend money on in 1976, which was before the machinery of modern marketing had developed the tools to manufacture familiarity fast enough to substitute for the real thing. Audiences went to films because of names they recognized, and Stallone's name was not one they recognized, and the investment required to produce this screenplay at the level it deserved could not be responsibly committed against the commercial uncertainty that an unknown lead represented regardless of how exceptional the material was. The executive delivered this argument without hostility, with the clean professional clarity of someone presenting findings rather than rendering a judgment, and Stallone sat with it and did not interrupt because the argument was structurally sound, and interrupting a structurally sound argument before it finishes is a way of avoiding it rather than answering it. The practical argument arrived second, and was in some ways more difficult than the commercial one because it came attached to specific names that represented specific realities. Ryan O'Neal had agreed to read the screenplay. James Caan had expressed interest. Burt Reynolds had been mentioned in conversations that had already begun at a preliminary level. Any of these names attached to this material transformed the project from a commercial uncertainty into a commercial probability, and the difference between uncertainty and probability in the language of film financing was the difference between a film that might get made and a film that would get made. And surely the goal was the film getting made. Surely what Stallone cared about most fundamentally was the story reaching the people it was written for, and the fastest and most certain path to that outcome had names attached to it that were not his. He listened to this and felt the specific discomfort of an argument that is trying to redefine what you want in order to make what you're being offered seem like a reasonable substitute for it. He recognized the technique. He had encountered versions of it in every room he had sat in for 6 years. He did not say this. He sat with the discomfort and let the argument finish. The generous argument was the third, and in some ways the kindest, and therefore in some ways the cruelest because it was framed entirely as concern for his future. $250,000 for a first screenplay from an unknown writer was not a standard offer. It was an exceptional offer, an offer that communicated genuine respect for the quality of the material and genuine desire to see him succeed as a writer, which was a real career with real longevity that this screenplay could serve as the foundation of if he allowed it to. Take the money, write the next one. Use this as the proof of concept for a writing life that would provide everything he needed without requiring him to stake the entire enterprise on the specific and uncertain gamble of an acting career that the industry had spent 6 years declining to validate. He heard the kindness in this argument, and he heard the assumption underneath the kindness, the assumption that what he was doing in these rooms was performing a negotiating position that would eventually yield to a sufficient offer rather than expressing a condition that no offer could address, and he understood that the 4 men across the table had not yet fully understood what kind of meeting they were actually in. The fourth executive delivered the verdict. He was the one who had said nothing through the first 3 arguments, sitting at the far end of the table with the particular stillness of someone who has been designated to say the thing the others have been building toward and is waiting for the right moment to say it. He looked at Stallone with the matter-of-fact directness of a man who believes he is doing someone a favor by telling them the truth without softening it and said, "Nobody is going to pay money to watch you on a screen. Not as a cruelty. As a professional assessment delivered in the tone of a physical law, the tone you use when you are telling someone that gravity operates in a specific direction and that their plans need to account for this fact rather than proceed as though the fact does not exist." The room settled into the silence that follows a thing being said that everyone in the room knew was the real center of every conversation that had preceded it, but that nobody had said out loud until this moment. Stallone sat in that silence and did the arithmetic of his actual life for approximately 20 seconds and felt, for those 20 seconds, that the man was right. Not that he wanted the man to be right. That the man was right. That 6 years of no was not a temporary condition preceding a yes, but simply the accurate description of a world that had been trying to tell him something true about himself that he had been refusing to hear. He sat with this for 20 seconds and felt its full weight and did not look away from it, and did not perform the confidence he did not feel in that specific moment. And then something happened that was not confidence and was not self-belief in any motivational sense, and was not the arrival of certainty that he was right and the 4 executives were wrong. What arrived in the silence was Chuck Wepner. Not the idea of Chuck Wepner. Not the lesson of Chuck Wepner as a motivational abstraction. The specific physical image of a man going down on a technical knockout in the 15th round of a fight with Muhammad Ali with 19 seconds remaining on the clock. Not winning. Not being vindicated by the outcome. simply not stopping before the thing was finished. Stallone sat in that chair in a conference room on the 14th floor of a building on Fifth Avenue and understood that the question the fourth executive had just posed was not actually about whether the assessment was correct. The assessment might be correct. The four men across the table were experienced professionals who had spent decades learning to read the industry they worked in, and their reading of it might be entirely accurate. The question was simpler and more personal, and had nothing to do with who was right. The question was whether he was the kind of person who stops with 19 seconds left on the clock. He already knew the answer. He had known it since July when he watched Wepner go down and felt something he recognized as the most important thing he had seen in a sporting event in his life. He looked at David Picker and said 4 words. "I need to play Rocky." The same 4 words he had said at the beginning of the meeting. Delivered in the same quiet tone with the same complete absence of performance, as if the previous 40 minutes had been a weather event that had passed through the room and left the landscape unchanged. Picker looked at him for a long moment with the expression of a man recalibrating his understanding of what kind of meeting he is actually in. The room was quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when the script everyone has been following has run out of pages and nobody has written what comes next. Picker had been in this industry for 25 years, and he had sat across from difficult talent and unreasonable talent and delusional talent and talent that turned out to be correct, and he was good at telling the difference between stubbornness and vision because the difference between them is not visible in the moment of disagreement, but in the quality of the certainty behind it. Stubbornness has an edge to it, a defensiveness that reveals the anxiety underneath. What he was looking at across the table had no edge. It had the particular stillness of a man who had made his decision before he walked through the door and had come to the meeting not to be persuaded, but to give them the opportunity to meet his one condition, and who was entirely prepared to leave without the deal if the condition was not met, and who did not experience that preparedness as courage, because it was not courage. It was simply the accurate expression of what he actually was. Picker asked him one question. He said, "If we do this your way and it fails, what happens to you?" Stallone said the same thing that's happening now. Picker was quiet for a moment. Then he said they would need to reduce the budget significantly. $1 million. The $250,000 offer was withdrawn entirely. He would receive $23,000 to write, produce input on, and star in a film that United Artists was making because they believed in the screenplay and had concluded that the man who wrote it was not going to let it go without himself attached to it, and that the screenplay was worth the risk even if their confidence in the lead remained what it was. He called Barbara from a payphone outside the United Artists offices in the January cold of Fifth Avenue and told her they had a deal, and she asked how much, and he told her $23,000, and she was quiet for a moment and then asked whether that was enough to get Butkus back. He said he didn't know yet, but that he had the number of the man who bought the dog, and he was going to call that afternoon. The man who had bought Butkus had kept the dog and liked the dog and was not immediately interested in selling him back. Stallone offered $100, and the man said no. He offered $150, and the man said the dog had grown on him. He eventually paid $3,000 to recover an animal he had sold for $25, which was the kind of arithmetic that would have been incomprehensible to him 3 weeks earlier, and which he completed without hesitation, because the dog was not a purchase. The dog was the specific promise he had made to himself about what the end of this looked like, and promises of that particular kind do not get renegotiated on the basis of what they cost. Principal photography began in January 1976 and was completed in 28 days on location in Philadelphia on a budget that required solutions that larger productions never have to find because larger productions can spend their way out of problems that small ones have to think their way out of. The guerrilla authenticity that audiences would respond to was not a creative choice. It was a financial constraint that turned out to be the film's most powerful quality, the way limitations sometimes produce the very thing that abundance would have prevented. Stallone was on set before anyone else every morning and left after everyone else every night, not because the contract required it, but because he understood in a way that could not be communicated to someone who had not sat in a waiting room with $11 and a manila folder what it meant to have been given the thing you refused to trade away. Rocky opened on November 21, 1976, in limited release in New York and Los Angeles. It made $225 million worldwide. It was nominated for 10 Academy Awards and won 3, including Best Picture. It was the highest-grossing film of 1976. The budget had been $1 million. Buckus the Bulldog appears in the film in the training sequences, running alongside the man in the gray sweatsuit through the Philadelphia dawn, because Stallone wrote him into the screenplay not as sentiment, but as documentation. The dog was the promise. Putting the dog in the film was the most honest record he knew how to make of the fact that the promise had been kept. When David Picker gave his one interview about the film after its success, he said he had known the screenplay was exceptional and had not known Stallone was exceptional, and that he should have known because it was the same thing.
He was right about that.
It was the same thing. The man who wrote those 87 pages in 3.5 days in July of 1975, and the man who sat in a conference room in January of 1976 and said the same 4 words at the end of the meeting that he had said at the beginning were the same person expressing the same truth in 2 different forms, and the truth was simple and had nothing to do with talent or destiny or the motivational architecture of success. It was about 19 seconds. It was about the specific kind of person who does not stop before the thing is finished regardless of what the arithmetic says, and regardless of what 4 experienced professionals in an expensive conference room have concluded about the commercial viability of watching him on a screen. Chuck Wepner went down with 19 seconds left and lost on a technical knockout and went home to Bayonne, New Jersey, knowing something about himself that the record books could not record and that no outcome could have given him or taken away. Stallone watched him do it and understood. He went home and wrote it down. Then he walked into every room that told him no and said the same 4 words until one room said yes. That is the whole story. That is all of it.